Well, good evening. I hope you've had a good week so far, and I hope that you've been able to enjoy this day. And this evening, as we study, I want us to think about Luke chapter 6. And we're going to look at a portion of Luke chapter 6 in just a moment. But I wonder, have you ever really stopped to think about the uniqueness of the Christian life? You think about how unconventional its nature is. And really, in the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus teaches, he offers some very unconventional wisdom. And so the things that Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount are really countercultural. They're against the grain of the times in which he lived. And so it's very unconventional, we would say. And when you look at the nature of the Christian life, you have to think about the unconventionality of the way we're called to live. It's a whole different life from that the world says we ought to live. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus offers some of this wisdom for us and helps us to understand the life that we've been called to live. You see, Jesus taught about submissiveness and meekness. His teaching was revolutionary. It was not like the traditions of his day, but it was something that was so radical that it caused many people to question him and wonder about his teaching. Jesus taught and provided a lot of information and helpful advice on relationships that we have with one another. And so in Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew shares what's been called the Six Antitheses. But Luke, in Luke's gospel, he only shares, it seems, just one. Now, the antitheses that we talk about are those sections of Jesus' teaching where he addresses the fact that they have heard that it was said X. And he says, but I say to you. And so these are the antitheses that we see. As I said, Matthew has 6, and Luke seems to only have 1. I do think it's important that as we look at these statements of Jesus, when he says, you have heard that it was said by those of old, but I say to you. When Jesus says the statements, but I say to you, Jesus is not changing the law. But rather what Jesus is doing is helping the people to understand that they were not following God's intended purpose for the laws that Jesus addresses. Now again, Luke only shares 1 in his account of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And we see it in Luke chapter 6, verse 27. This is the antithesis in Luke's account of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Luke chapter 6, verse 27, Jesus says, but I say to you who hear. And this is what he says. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. He says, bless those who persecute you, those who curse you, he says. And pray for those who abuse you. Those are the things that Jesus says. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. He says, make sure and bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you. Now, he begins this statement not by saying, you've heard that it was said by those of old. But Luke just simply records the words of Jesus as he says, but I say to you who hear. Now, the statements here, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. These are very unconventional teachings of Jesus, very radical thoughts, because that's not the way that the world works. The way the world works is that we hate our enemies. We don't love our enemies. We don't do good things for those people who hate us. We are just indifferent or we lash out in ways that we shouldn't lash out toward them. We don't bless people who curse us. The world says that we ought to curse those who curse us. And certainly we don't want to pray for those who abuse us. That's what the world says. But Jesus' teaching is so countercultural. And I think that challenges us in our way of thinking, because so often the world dictates the way that we respond. But yet, as followers of Jesus, we have to be diligent to listen to what Jesus has said and follow his teaching and realize that though his wisdom he shares with us is very unconventional, this is the purpose of God's laws for us, the way of living. And he expects us to live up to his intended purpose for these things. And so that's a challenge for us. And so again, this one antithesis here in Luke's account of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. But I want you to think about what happens next in this teaching. And this is not the only portion of the teaching of Jesus that we want to look at. I want to look all the way down through verse 36, but I want us to think about the fact that all of this has to do with love. It has to do with our response in our relationships, the way that God is calling us to live and how he calls us to treat others. And all of this is wrapped up here in verses 27 down through 36. But I want you to look at verse 29. Jesus says, "To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also." Now, certainly we've heard this, and these are very familiar thoughts to us. You think about what Matthew's account says. It records Jesus as saying, "But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other." That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. Now, the question that I would have with this, while Luke does not record Jesus as saying the one who slaps you on the right cheek, the question that I would have is why Jesus says the right cheek. Why does he mention the right cheek? Well, if a right-handed person were to stand facing you, then they would have to strike your face with the back of their right hand, and they would strike your right cheek with the back of their right hand. Now, according to Jewish rabbinic law, to hit a man with the back of the hand was twice as insulting as hitting him with the flat or the open part of the hand. And so I'm convinced that in Jesus' teaching here, while Luke doesn't give us the full statement of Jesus, we see it in Matthew's account. I'm convinced that Jesus here is saying that even if someone hurls the most hateful, the most calculated insult at us, we are under no circumstances to respond in like manner. That's what Jesus is teaching here. We're not to retaliate when someone does this, even when they hurl at us the most insulting, most calculated insult that there could be. Jesus says, that's not the way you respond. You don't respond the way the world does by retaliating, but rather turn the other cheek to them also. It's about the way that we respond, the way that we interact. All this deals with relationship and how we treat one another. Well, you keep reading in verse 29 out of Luke chapter 6, and Jesus says, "And from one who takes away your cloak," he says, "do not withhold your tunic either." Now, a couple of things about the cloak and the tunic. The tunic was this long inner garment. It was readily available. Even the poorest of man would have had a change of tunics. But the cloak, it was a blanket-like outer garment that was worn in the day as a robe, but then was used at night as a covering or a blanket. And so the average Jew would have only one cloak. We see evidence of this in the book of Exodus. It's Exodus 22, verses 26 and 27, where the Bible says, "If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep?" And so the cloak was that blanket-like outer garment that was used, like I said, as a robe during the day, but at night it was used as a blanket. And what Jesus is saying here is that his followers should display a radically unselfish attitude toward their rights and their property. And so therefore, if somebody takes your cloak, don't withhold your tunic, but give them your tunic as well. And then look at verse 30 and following, and I'll read down through verse 36. But listen to the rest of what Jesus says. Verse 30 of Luke chapter 6. Give to whoever begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. But love your enemies, and do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. So you think about what Jesus is teaching here. And He says there in the beginning, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. And then He offers some practical advice and practical illustrations of what that actually looks like. And Jesus is saying that we need to have such a radically unselfish attitude toward the things that God has blessed us with, ready and willing to give to those, even from people who take from us. That's the attitude that we are to have. That's how it affects the relationships that we have, is the way that we respond. And so therefore, He says in verse 31, as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. It's interesting when you look at that statement, the golden rule, as we call it, you look at that statement and there's an aspect of it that says, well, we come away reading it and we say, well, we're supposed to treat people the way that we want to be treated by them. And that's the reality. But ultimately, we tend to place that statement in the context of someone having treated us a certain way or someone doing something for us. And so therefore, we should return the favor. That's often how we look at this. But that's not the way that this statement is framed. This statement says, as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. And so there's an aspect of this that is proactive. And so there's a lifestyle and an attitude that we are to have. And we ought to actively seek to do for others what we wish they would do for us. Not what they do for us, that we should return the favor, but rather be proactive in what we do and in our interactions with others. And so as we see in this last portion, verse 32 and following, Jesus talking about love. If you just simply love those who love you, there's no benefit in that. If you simply do good to those that do good to you, there's no benefit in that. If you simply lend to those who are going to pay you back, there's no benefit in that. But Jesus says again in verse 35, but love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. And so Jesus brings this teaching full circle from the opening statement of what He expects, of the way that God intended for us to live and respond and react to people around us. And then He gives those illustrations of what that looks like. And then He comes full circle and says it again, love your enemies, do good, lend, expecting nothing in return. Understand that God is merciful, He's saying. And God, He gives. He gives generously, even to those that are ungrateful. He's kind toward them, even the ungrateful and the evil. So therefore, be merciful as your Father is merciful. And so all of this is couched in who God is and in the nature of God. So Jesus says, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. And He says, pray for those who abuse you. And Jesus, again, as I said, is sharing some very unconventional wisdom. You see, the world says aggression, but Jesus says meekness. The world says pride, but Jesus says humility. The world says headstrong, but Jesus says submission. I think all of these concepts are very simple, yet they are much harder when trying to put them into practice. I like this statement from C.S. Lewis. He said, "To be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you." It's about understanding what God has done for us and responding accordingly. While we were dead in our trespasses and sins, God made us alive together with Christ. And so for us, we need to make sure that as we strive to be followers of Jesus, we recognize and remember all that God has done for us, and that we allow God's grace and mercy to flow through us toward those around us. Now, you think about the reality of the world around us. There are a lot of people who fail to understand exactly why Jesus would ask his followers to endure such circumstances as having people strike you on your cheek or take away your cloak. Why Jesus would expect his followers to endure such circumstances. Many people struggle to understand why. Well, the truth is we are called to be set apart, different or distinct from the world. One writer said this, "Every member of our church is a missionary. Without the formality of a setting apart, we should be so set apart from the ways of the world that we can teach the gospel, which is our Father's way of life, simply by the very lives we live." I think that's so true. We have to be a people who understand what God has done for us and are willing to be so set apart that the lives we live proclaim the gospel or the good news of Jesus. The reality is, separation to God or separation from the world is the very foundation of a Christian living. Burton Kaufman said, "When one strives honestly and faithfully to live up to Jesus' teaching in this matter or any other, forces far beyond the knowledge of any man are working for the success of the obedient follower of the Lord." What Burton Kaufman is saying there is that God is on our side. He is helping us. He will strengthen us. And when we strive to do his will, God helps us to accomplish that. Jesus said, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you." The world around us, it will know that we belong to him by our love that we have for one another. I think this involves our actions, our reactions, our humility, our meekness, our submission to the will of God. If we're going to show others that we belong to him, we have to first love in everything that we do, in everything that we say. And that involves our actions, our reactions, our humility, our meekness, our submission to the will of God. All of that is involved in what Jesus is saying here. He says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who abuse you. Let's make sure that we're striving each and every day to honor and glorify God in everything that we say and do.